The circulatory system is the first system we're going to go through in this Unit 3, where we're going to be talking about homeostasis. The circulatory system's function is to get the good stuff to the cells, oxygen, nutrients, and other substances, and removing wastes from cell processes that happen. A transportation system in the city is a really good comparison to the circulatory system because goods go into the city via the streets, highways, subway train lines, and wastes are removed using the same means. The heart has 4 chambers. A septum is a wall that separates the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart, and that prevents the oxygen-poor blood that's coming from the body and the oxygen-rich blood that's coming from the lungs from mixing. We talk about the right side and the left side of the heart not based on how we're looking at it, but how it's positioned in a person's body. So that's why the right and the left are on opposite sides from what you might think. Of the 4 chambers, the upper chambers are called atria, singular is atrium. These receive blood from the body, just like an atrium in a building receives people into it. The bottom chambers are called ventricles. They are in charge of pumping blood out of the heart. Blood from the body enters the heart through the right atrium, from the lungs through the left atrium. When the atria contract, blood flows into the ventricles. There are valves that are located between the atria and the ventricles to make sure that blood keeps moving in one direction. There are valves also located at the exits of each ventricle, again to make sure that the blood stays in the blood vessels and moving through the blood vessels instead of back into the heart. The heart has its own blood supply given to it by the coronary arteries. These are pretty small arteries. They're at higher risk because of that, of getting blocked. If they are blocked, the heart muscle won't get oxygen. And that's what happens during a heart attack. There's blockage of the coronary arteries by fats. We call them plaques. That's what can lead to a heart attack. The heart really has 2 sides to it, 2 pumps. One pump gets blood to the lungs. The other pump gets blood to the rest of the body. And these are called pulmonary and systemic circulation. So pulmonary circulation is coming from the right side of the heart. It gets oxygen-poor blood from the heart to the lungs. In the lungs then, carbon dioxide moves out of the blood and oxygen moves into the blood. And then that oxygen-rich blood goes to the left side of the heart. Then the left side of the heart pumps the oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body through systemic circulation. Then at the cellular level, in the cells, they absorb the oxygen and then they load the blood with carbon dioxide that they've produced. Now the oxygen-poor blood returns to the right side of the heart for another trip to the lungs to pick up oxygen. The heart has to pump in a certain order. The atria pump first, and then the ventricles. If you've ever listened to a heartbeat, you kind of hear 2 sounds. Some people describe it as being a lub-dub sound. The lub is the atria contracting, and then the dub is the ventricles contracting. There are 3 main types of blood vessels that blood flows through in the body, in the systemic circulation. The blood flows first through arteries, then through capillaries, and then through veins. Arteries are large vessels that carry blood from the heart to the tissues of the body. Except for the arteries that carry the blood to the lungs, which we call the pulmonary arteries, all arteries carry oxygen-rich blood. They have really thick elastic walls that help them withstand blood pressure, which is the pressure produced when the heart contracts and pumps blood through them. They have to be stronger because they're the first blood vessels to receive blood, and so they have the most pressure on them. The very smallest blood vessels are called capillaries. That's where the arteries reduce and get smaller and smaller and smaller. The capillaries are 1 cell thick. They're so narrow that blood cells pass through them in a single file. Like I said, their walls are 1 cell thick. They allow oxygen and nutrients to diffuse or move from the blood into tissues, and then carbon dioxide and other waste products to move from those tissues back into the blood so it can be delivered back to the heart. After blood passes through the capillaries, it returns to the heart through veins. Especially in the legs or below the heart, blood has to flow against gravity through the large veins in arms and legs. Many veins are located near and between muscles. When muscles contract, the muscles squeeze the veins. That helps push blood towards the heart. Another reason that exercise is a good thing, or being active is a good thing. Also, veins contain valves, just like the heart does, to ensure that blood moves in one direction, back up to the heart. As I said before, when the heart contracts, it has a lot of pressure to get that blood all the way through the entire body. That pressure is known as blood pressure. Blood pressure falls between beats when the heart is relaxing, but the system remains under pressure because of the arterial walls. Without that pressure, blood would stop flowing through the body. Healthcare workers measure blood pressure, which is a blood pressure cuff. The fancy term for that is sphygmomanometer. There are 2 different numbers that the healthcare worker listens to. The systolic pressure is the force when the ventricles contract. And then the diastolic pressure is when the ventricles relax. Normal blood pressure is measured at 120/80. Sensory receptors in the blood vessels detect blood pressure and send impulses to the brainstem. This is one example of homeostasis. When blood pressure is high, the nervous system releases chemicals that relax the smooth blood vessels in the blood vessel walls. When blood pressure is low, there are other chemicals that are released that cause the muscles in the vessel walls to contract. The kidneys also help regulate blood pressure. They affect the volume of blood. The kidneys will remove more water from the blood and eliminate it in urine when blood pressure is high, or conserve it when blood pressure is low. Next up is the respiratory system. The difference between respiration and breathing is that respiration is what's, I guess you would call it, scientifically going on. There's gas exchange between a body and the environment, which is what I was talking about at the capillary level in the body. The respiratory system picks up oxygen from the air we inhale and releases carbon dioxide into the air we exhale. The circulatory system helps with this, which is what we were just talking about. Links the exchange of gases in the lungs with the exchange of gases in our body tissue. The nose does a couple different things. It filters, moistens, and warms the air that's coming into our body. Then we have the pharynx, or the throat, which is the passageway for both air and food. Air then will move into the trachea, or the windpipe. We've talked about the epiglottis before. There's the flap of tissue called the epiglottis that covers the trachea, making sure that the food or liquid goes into the esophagus. Between the pharynx and the trachea is the larynx, which we sometimes call the voice box. It contains vocal cords. That's what gives us our ability to speak. Mucus in the trachea also filters our air. Cilia, little hairs lining the trachea, kind of looks like this, will sweep the mucus and the trapped particles up away from the lungs and toward the pharynx. That's what initiates the cough reflex then, and then they can be swallowed or spit out, those particles that are potentially going to cause infection. From the trachea, there's a fork in the road. There are two large tubes called bronchi. Each one leads to a lung. Then the large bronchus divides into smaller bronchi, and they divide up into smaller passageways called bronchioles. The bronchioles will divide until they end up in these little grape-like clusters called alveoli. Capillaries surround each individual grape, or alveolus. When air enters alveoli, oxygen dissolves and diffuses across the thin capillary walls into the blood. Oxygen moves in this direction because it's greater in the alveoli than it is in the blood. So that's what you see happening here. Oxygen is going into the alveolus. Into the blood. Carbon dioxide goes the opposite direction, from the blood into the alveoli, because its concentration is greater in the blood than it is in the air in the alveoli. The air you inhale contains 21% oxygen and 0.04% of carbon dioxide. Exhaled air contains less than 15% oxygen and 4% carbon dioxide. So your lungs remove about a fourth of the oxygen in the air you inhale and increase the carbon dioxide content by a factor of 100. Diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli into the capillaries is a passive process. It doesn't require any energy. And it stops when oxygen concentration is the same in both places, in the blood and the alveoli. Hemoglobin is what transports the oxygen. It binds to the dissolved oxygen, and it enables the diffusion from the alveoli to continue. Hemoglobin takes care of so much oxygen that it increases the blood's oxygen carrying capacity more than 60 times. When carbon dioxide diffuses from body tissues to capillaries, most of it enters red blood cells and forms carbonic acid. Some of it dissolves in plasma or binds to hemoglobin and proteins in the plasma. These processes are reversed in the lungs, where carbon dioxide is released into alveoli and exhaled. The lungs are found in two different sacs called pleural membranes in the chest cavity, and at the bottom of the chest cavity it's closed. It's a dome-shaped muscle called the diaphragm. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and flattens. There are muscles between the ribs that also contract and raise the rib cage. These actions increase the volume of the chest cavity And because of that, it allows the lungs to be able to fill and expand. On an exhale, the rib cage and the diaphragm relax. This decreases the volume of the chest cavity and makes air pressure greater than atmospheric pressure. Air rushes back out of the lungs. To exhale is usually a passive process. Muscles aren't contracting, they're relaxing. But to blow out a candle, to speak, to sing, or to yell, you need more force. That's provided by muscles between the ribs and the muscles of the abdominals, which contract as the diaphragm relaxes. The only reason that breathing works is because the chest cavity is closed. It's a closed system. If a wound punctures the chest, even if it doesn't affect the lungs directly, air can leak into the chest cavity and make breathing impossible. This is one reason that chest wounds are always very serious. We can control our breathing somewhat when we're swimming, when we're playing an instrument, but it's not purely voluntary. We don't have to think about it. Your nervous system has final control of your breathing muscles, whether you're conscious or not. Breathing is initiated by a part of the brainstem called the medulla oblongata. We'll talk about that when we get to the nervous system. Sensory neurons there gather information about carbon dioxide levels and send that information to the breathing center. Then the breathing center will send impulses that cause the diaphragm and chest muscles to contract, bringing air into the lungs. If carbon dioxide levels are high, breathing rate will go up. If carbon dioxide levels are lower, breathing rate will go down. Next up, cell transport.